Hello and welcome to Listen Up Landlords with Ben Beadle and me, Richard Blanco. What impact is the Renters' Rights Act having on HMOs? Tenants have much more control over the length of their contracts now, affecting notice periods for selling and making it harder for landlords to plan any kind of changeover cycle outside of the student sector. Are new rules around limits on rent in advance, pets, and letting to families with children having an impact? And how are landlords dealing with groups of sharers where one tenant giving notice ends the contract for the whole group? Well, we have an experienced HMO landlord on hand to give us some practical advice. The NRLA has joined forces with the Lettings Industry Council. I'll be asking Chair Teresa Wallace what we can expect from this new alliance. But first, new law, new landscape. How are you adapting your business to the opportunities and challenges that the Renters' Rights Act has spurned for all of us? Does the end of fixed terms herald a new era of flexibility where more landlords embrace a hybrid business model of short and long term lets? Or maybe you do feel the lure of serviced accommodation in spite of impending regulation and a less favourable tax regime. Just how big an issue will the 12-month letting ban become for landlords intending to sell where the buyer falls through? Landlord to landlord selling has been on the increase, but which landlords are buying and which are selling? And does increased incorporation mean that more landlords are buying and selling whole businesses? Well, Ben, the short term and long term markets have traditionally been quite separate, but now tenants can give 2 months' notice at any time. Do you think we might see more convergence?
Well, I think we might see more landlords look to that sector as an option, but I suspect that it's probably too early to tell at this stage. I think my sense, and certainly having done a number of our Connect events across the country, is that landlords are waiting to see rather than taking any sort of firm decisions about different cohorts and different sectors. But I mean, one thing's very clear, that the world hasn't fallen in with all of these changes coming in. And I think that what I took from certainly our Newcastle event is that landlords are taking a considered look at the landscape. They're weighing up their various options that are open to them. And they're not ruling anything out for the moment. So I think it's perfectly possible. But of course, we'll hear from Merilee later. It is a bit of a different ballgame when it comes to the short let market. And just because you're an experienced landlord in the long let market doesn't mean that it's going to be a stroll in the park when it comes to short lettings.
Yes, it's going to be so interesting talking to Merilee because some of us are worried that tenants could game the system and sneakily do short lets by giving notice on day one and just being in the property for 2 months. But of course, Merilee thinks that that's an opportunity rather than anything negative. How do you feel about selling to another landlord, Ben? Because we've seen that stats show more and more landlords are doing that. I must admit, I struggle to get over the potential discount issue. I assume that all landlords will be like me and want to drive a really hard bargain and therefore make me sell at a much lower price. Is that something that worries you, or do you think it's a really good way forward?
Well, I've actually done it, Richard. I can't remember if I
Oh,
told you this. So
no.
I actually sold two flats to an. Did I buy one? I bought one, sold two. I did a bit of wheeling and dealing a few years ago, and all of those were to other landlords. And honestly, I struggle to see the downside of such a sale. I don't think. I mean, I would characterize it another way. You're buying a going concern. You're buying you're buying rent from day one. You're buying a known entity. If I were a seller, I'd be saying that that comes at a premium. And certainly, I didn't really see any significant difference in terms of um, asking prices because because I was selling with a tenant in situ. On the contrary, it was very much seen as a benefit. So I think we're going to see much more of this sort of stuff. And we're hearing from James later, who was talking at our Newcastle event a week or so ago. And there's a lot of interest in this sort of stuff, particularly against the backdrop of the reforms maybe making it slightly more difficult to get possession of your property. This is a really effective or can be a really effective solution for the right people.
Yes, so we might well see a change in mindset. We already are, I think, amongst landlords. Of course, if the property comes with planning permission for an HMO and it's already had a license and stuff like that, it could come as quite an attractive package. I wonder if the investment needed for MEES, that's minimum energy efficiency standards, will precipitate big decisions around selling. Ben, somebody told me that they just had to update their EPC and their property was previously a D, it's now a G because of the new model for assessment. And, they have changed absolutely nothing. And they're now having to look at getting an exemption. It's a real worry. And I wonder how many people are just going to throw in the towel around this.
Wow. Well, that's a rotten story, Richard. I didn't know that. I mean, what I would say is, I think, in fact, the minister's been in touch on this very subject this week with us. Obviously, we've been quite successful when it comes to minimum energy efficiency standards around the cap and the tapering of the cap. And I think that the minister understands that if you've got a low asset value, that £10,000 will mean different things to different people in various parts of the country. So we're very pleased to see him adopt that methodology, because notwithstanding the story that you've set out, it does go some way to alleviate concerns over significant capital expenditure. But we're going to be meeting with Minister McCluskey in the next couple of weeks, talking about these issues and rollouts and things like that. And I'm very pleased that he's receptive to our thinking in this area. But certainly, this is something that is playing on landlords' minds, because in a way, as we've discussed before, when it comes to renters' rights, you can make decisions about adjusting if that's what you want to do. You can't magic up £10,000 if you haven't got it, and you can't magic up an exemption. It's a straightforward business decision about whether you stay in the sector. It's really as simple as that.
Yes, I really worry about what MEES holds for us, really, with the current regulations and planned arrangements. But let's introduce our guests now. So, James Donoghue is founder of Landlord Property Exchange, and we've got Merilee Karr with us, who is founder and CEO of UnderTheDoormat Group. Thanks so much for joining us. And let's start with Merilee. Now, Merilee, you see an opportunity in the Renters' Rights Act around flexibility. You've said that you think the whole model has been dismantled, really, with ASTs going out. And it's not just a legal change, it's also going to be a behavioral one. Um, what would it take for your average landlord, do you think, to pivot their business in the way that you're seeing, where you see the opportunities lie?
Well, look, I mean, I think the first question is, what is really the change? And the change is really that it now consumers or tenants actually have a lot more choice and a lot more flexibility. But if we think about it, that's true in so many segments of the market. It used to be in mobile phones, you had to have a year-long contract, and now you can get pay as you go in almost any plan that you want. So I think it is just the market adapting to the fact that consumers want flexibility in every part of their life. And the law allows that to take place in how people rent where they're living. Um, Now, I think also it can get a little bit blown out of proportion. I mean, the average person isn't going to go and take the effort to rent a place, set up all their utilities, and then just serve notice for 2 months. And I think what is important is to recognize when you need to offer other options. So I think when you're talking to an institutional landlord, and there are lots of those guys, or people who have portfolios of properties, um, in those instances, where they're able to offer short-term options, where utilities are all organized, all the furniture and all of the fittings and everything else that you need to actually live in a property, your coffee machine, your plates, all these types of things. If those things are on offer in a short-term model, and the person coming to stay has the choice between a short-term option or a long-term option, then there would be very little incentive for them to choose to just go and take out a long-term tenancy and serve notice, because they have the option of a hassle-free way to rent for a short period of time. And so I think where this change affects people is that if consumers have both choices, they're always going to choose the easier option for them, even if it's a bit more expensive. And so I think it is about the market adapting and having both of those options available for people, so that we don't end up seeing people kind of gaming the system, which I'm not really sure people actually want to do if they have a good alternative. So I think that's kind of where the market is. To your second point, though, how easy is it to shift from doing long-term rentals to short-term rentals? I think Ben really mentioned it quite well. Short-term rentals is hospitality. That is very different in terms of the expectations that a guest is going to have, and we call them guests, not tenants. So, that mentality and that service level isn't for everyone. You've got to be on call 24/7. Your service levels and fixing things is hours, not days. You've got to be willing to be checking people in and out, managing expectations of different guests all the time. Um, Actually, in short term, every single new guest is a new tenant. And some will be less needy, others will need more attention. But you're only as good as your last review. So you've got to be on your toes to succeed in a market which is much more fast moving. So I think for some that is attractive and is interesting, but I see it much more as a mix, as part of a strategy, not necessarily turning everything over to serviced accommodation. But if a tenant moves out in May, you might do short term for the summer and then go back to finding a long-term tenant in September. So I think thinking about it as a gap filler, thinking about it as part of your strategy, and at a portfolio level, offering both options is really some of the opportunities that are going to be most, I would say, most prevalent within the market.
Now, we saw many landlords shift into short term accommodation when it wasn't subject to Section 24. Those are the finance and tax arrangements that lots of people will be familiar with. Now, furnished holiday lets are subject to Section 24. What has happened, Merilee? Have we seen a lot of landlords pull out?
I would say actually that's a tale of two stories, which is in the traditional holiday let areas of the country. So, these will be, your Cornwalls, Devons, the Lake District, the Peak District, those types of places. You will have had more people that were taking advantage of the furnished holiday lets tax benefits. And therefore it's affected those areas much more. I think in your more typical short-term rental accommodation, actually very few people were using that tax treatment, and therefore it's had less of an effect. And I think in many ways it is not a single thing; it is a combination of a number of things. In places like Wales and some parts of England, there's also double council tax that can be applied to second homes. There's lots of things in the landscape that's happening kind of all at once. So it's hard to isolate whether one single thing is having that effect. But certainly for people who have second homes that they want to earn an income from, of course, that is a negative. But, at the end, if you still want to have that second home, it's unlikely that people are just leaving the market because of that one change on its own.
Okay. Now, James, 27% of landlords are now selling with tenants in situ. That's according to Pegasus Research. We are seeing more landlords trading portfolios, I understand. Which landlords are buying and which are selling?
It's certainly a tale of certainly two different types of landlords now, which are coming to play. We're certainly seeing those who are looking, certainly not completely to exit, but perhaps rationalize their portfolios, are those who have been effectively a landlord maybe the last 20 to 30 years. They've been in that position where perhaps lending was certainly simpler. The interest rates were more favorable, and that enabled certainly landlords to grow and scale in a manner which enabled them to get further volume over that time. Those landlords, however, come to a position where certainly owning the properties in their personal name is perhaps no longer as tax efficient as it once was. And I think we're starting to see the ramifications of those come to fruition, where higher interest rates, owning them in your personal name, And I think also age profile, of some of the clients that we work with, particular selling clients, just got to that position in their lives where perhaps the management, the requirements, the increased regulation is just too much at the same time now, and they're in that position where, okay, now is the time to perhaps have a real planned exit as to the portfolio, certainly rationalize those properties that aren't suiting their current needs. On the flip side, however, you've got prospective buyers still, and yes, there is. You probably, I think, certainly, there's the last survey the NRA certainly did. I think 7% of membership still said they're actively purchasing, which I think, okay, it is a small percentage of that, but it's still positive. It still demonstrates that there is activity in the market, and we're certainly seeing that on our side. Those prospective landlords, investors are perhaps more younger, perhaps more institutional and more professional. They've incorporated their portfolios. They've got a limited company set up. They have their team around them of an accountant, of a renovation team, of their solicitors, etc. They're really set up with the mindset to scale, and the very fact that they've incorporated it gives them a more tax efficient way of holding the asset and effectively being able to scale that. They used to also the increased regulation already, especially more perhaps newer, younger investors coming into the market. What's currently the landscape now is the norm. They're used to that. They're used to all the regulatory requirements that are in place. For them, that's fine because they factor that into their future strategies effectively.
James, a question from me. Thinking about HMOs with Article 4 directions, which restricts the creation of new ones, are these being exchanged at a premium? Is there a higher demand for this type of stuff?
So HMOs, we certainly specialise in, as well as other properties. Certainly those where there's Article 4, naturally, it's difficult. In fact, you can no longer get those licenses in those particular areas. And that's a real benefit around certain particular areas. So we've got prime example of one in the area of Bolton, Greater Manchester. Again, that's just gone into Article 4. And for that reason, HMOs, and we've sold a couple now in that particular area, have had real interest, provided some great competitive tension in the sales process. And that's because, the creation of new licenses, etc., is no longer viable. So absolutely, HMOs having been in Article 4 generally always garner that greater interest. And that's effectively because they're harder to get hold of. Portfolios as well in a whole, though, with HMOs are also very desirable. What I would say added to Article 4 are those where they're in the kind of university areas of the likes of Liverpool, Manchester, Newcastle, York, those particular areas where certainly HMOs are still highly desirable, but still obviously impacted by that Article 4.
And I'm guessing it's probably one of the few areas that you can still command a reasonable yield as a landlord. And with that in mind, how do you see the 12-month letting ban playing out, and whether that might alter landlord behaviour if they choose to sell?
So I think certainly it's going to push more people to consider that selling process, and ultimately this is why the tenant in situ sales process works very well in that regard. Not having to sell with vacant possession is certainly something which is more advantageous. I've certainly seen over the next 12 months there's going to be a higher growing proportion, should we say, of landlords in that particular space who are going to be looking to sell with those tenants in situ off the back of that lettings ban.
Very good. And Merilee, turning back to you, what is demand for short-term accommodation in the UK? What trends are you seeing? Holiday homes, serviced accommodation, stuff like that?
Look, I think one of the things that is often surprising to people is that nowadays across Europe, about 20% of accommodation nights are in short-term rentals. So you can imagine, 2 decades ago, that was almost nothing. And that now represents 20% of the demand for accommodation in transient stays. So there's absolutely a demand for it. And I think where it is particularly valuable is that, it provides a different type of accommodation for families, for people traveling together. And so what was once considered kind of an alternative is now mainstream. What we also saw during COVID was that lots of people tried staying in short term rentals globally that maybe hadn't previously, and preferences changed. So, what that means is now you also get business travelers who are looking for this type of accommodation. Trusted Stays is now able to sell any short term rentals that are meeting the right accreditation standards into corporates and into government. So there is a lot of value in new demand audiences that maybe didn't exist a decade ago. So I think that demand environment is there, but it is always with nuance. It will depend very much on the location. Sure, if
Sure.
you're in London, there is a year-round demand, which is a combination of leisure travelers, corporates, people coming for events, all those types of things. If you are in a seaside destination, it's obviously going to be very seasonal, and everything in between. So I think it is very location dependent, the types of demand that you'll get. Obviously, with macroeconomic challenges around the world, we're seeing lower travel in from the Middle East and slightly lower from North America this year than what we've seen in the past couple of years. But we also see high demand from across Europe, and certainly from within the UK as well. So I would say it is overall a strong market. I would also say, you know, regulation and registration coming into our sector will certainly play a role in supply. And is always, like anything, a supply and demand balance.
Well, I was going to ask you about that specifically, Merilee. So, with this popularity, it's obviously a sector that's now attracting greater regulation, greater scrutiny from government. How do you see this playing out? Do you think it will deter landlords from dipping their toe into this particular market?
I mean, look, we as a sector, I chaired the Short Term Accommodation Association for 7 years. We've been calling for registration for many years. We think it's a positive, and we think that the approach that the government is looking to take is something that we think will be helpful for the industry and transparency. It will also help things to be counted and really understand where the market is and how that's evolving over time. So I think that's going to be incredibly helpful. And we're hopeful that that's going to be forthcoming very, very soon. So that is happening. I think, like any market, landlords are going to be looking and saying, "Oh, well, what does regulation mean for my opportunity here?" And the one thing I would say is, I don't think that just because you feel overregulated in the long-term letting market, that should be the reason to consider short-term. Both markets are regulated, actually, from a point of view of health and safety and all these other things. There's loads of regulations that already apply to short-term rentals and serviced accommodation. So I wouldn't say that just because you come into this sector, it's somehow easier. But obviously, if you have a property which is in the right areas, where there is the right demand, then it is a sector that, if you do it well and you do it in the right way, following all the rules, all the regulations, etc., that it can be a successful market. So I think, like everything, it has its nuances, but I think the people who succeed are the people who are looking to do it properly, and not just looking to avoid regulation as their objective.
James, you heard me saying earlier that landlords drive a hard bargain. Surely all your clients are after a hefty discount, aren't they?
We like to call it win-win.
Yes.
I think ultimately, look, all landlords are investors. Ultimately, yes, they unless you've inherited the properties in some regard, but the vast majority of landlords have had to effectively secure a deal. Yeah, they have to negotiate and ensure that it's a suitable price for certainly for themselves, but obviously the other party. Now, we always, certainly in our experience, approach it with a win-win mentality, and we always advise clients to certainly have that from the outset, because everybody wants the same common goal, is to get to a suitable price that works for both parties. And if you have that perhaps more consultative, transparent approach from the outset, you generally get to that win-win scenario. And we find anyone who has a mentality of just wanting to seek the lowest possible price, or we've seen instances where perhaps prices are reduced at just before exchange or completion. It can leave a real challenge and a bitter taste in a lot of people's mouths. And this is why we very much, in terms of our approach, is have a more transparent way of both landlords coming to the deal from the same kind of benchmark, and actually having genuine direct discussions as to what their motivations and outcomes are. And your point with discounts, I mean, suitably there has to be some form of discount, I feel, applied perhaps to a larger portfolio type transaction. And the way we typically approach that is, as I say, having a very frank, transparent discussion between both parties. It's almost like an interviewing process where they get to meet one another, understand perhaps why a prospective landlord is exiting or rationalising some of their properties. That really helps the prospective buyer to understand, okay, well, how can I structure a deal? But likewise, it also puts the seller in the driving seat, because they really understand who that prospective new landlord or buyer will be, and do they feel that they're coming from a position of honesty, and they're actually going to be able to deliver on what they set out. And by really setting that tone from the outset in the negotiation, it really helps that that final price, that due diligence process, the sales regression to get to the end result that's required. Naturally, we're in the middle to police and ensure that does happen. Now, yes, you're going to get perhaps those potential clients who will just drive the hardest possible bargain. But in our experience, those who go in with that mentality generally don't come out with the outcome that they require.
So quite a thoughtful and sort of well curated process, I guess, there, to make it successful for both parties. Well, James Donahue and Merilee Karr, thanks very much for joining us. Next, the Lettings Industry Council has joined forces with the NRLA, and its chair, Teresa Wallace, is here to tell us more. Hello, Teresa. Thanks very much for joining us.
Hello, Richard. Thanks for having me.
Well, you're very welcome. And tell us a bit about the work of the Lettings Industry Council, first of all, Teresa.
The Lettings Industry Council was set up in 2014. I co-founded it. And it was at a time when we felt that the industry wasn't speaking to each other. It wasn't coming together. There were a lot of changes coming our way, and nobody seemed to be doing anything about it. Or if they were, everybody was working in silos. And so we started with a small group of the professional bodies, the ombudsman schemes, the deposit schemes, and a few other people. And then really it grew from there. We now are made up of stakeholders from right across the industry. Government departments come to our meetings. They also speak. And really our objective is to raise standards, whether that be property standards, but also the standards of the services that agents are providing.
Yes, I was just going to ask you what has driven the decision to join forces with the NRLA then, Teresa, and why now?
Okay, timing was one of the things. I retired from Savills at the end of March this year, and during the years of chairing TLIC, they have been very supportive. I think we've done a lot of very good work over the years. We've produced white papers, reports, etc. But I think maybe where we've been weak is actually sharing the good work that's been done. And really that's where the NRLA comes in, because they have a strong voice, established channels, and they have real influence. And I think we can work really well together now with that. And of course, whatever affects an agent, ultimately, it's the landlord who is affected at the end of the day. The agent is that sort of middle person that might have to deal with things differently. But whatever changes come our way, it's our landlords ultimately who it affects. And so the work that we are doing is to try and make things easier for landlords.
There are lots of great agents out there, Teresa, particularly those that are members of professional bodies. We still don't have that regulation of property agents that was proposed, I think, way back in 2019, I think. Hopefully that will get implemented at some point. I do remember many years ago someone telling me that a third of calls to the NLA, as it was then, advice time, were concerns and complaints about agents. I hope things have got better now. But some people might ask to what extent landlords and agents are good bedfellows, because, one might want to complain about the other.
Well, first of all, agents wouldn't have a business without landlords. They are their business. I think there's a lot of different things that we could look at here. There are still complaints, and we have an ombudsman. I think you've got a lot of agents out there. Some are very good, some don't have the training, and so they do make mistakes. Maybe they have the best intent, but they do make mistakes. And I'm a strong believer in qualifications. Regulation, at the moment, the government don't seem to have an appetite for it. I think it will come, but I think we could definitely start by raising our standards, by having minimum qualifications for everybody in lettings. Because I think there is so much now, there's so many different rules and regulations, the laws that we have to comply with, and new laws coming in all the time. The Renters' Rights Act being, topical at the moment, but it's huge. It's a huge amount of change, and I don't think that all agents have enough training to be able to act for their clients to the best that they should.
Yes, and you've outlined many of the challenges that are ahead of us there, I guess, Teresa. How will this new united body be able to serve the private rented sector and advance its aspirations? In many ways, it makes you very well placed, doesn't it, working with the NRLA?
Yes, and wearing an agency hat, it's always, to me, the most important thing has been trying to service landlords, giving them the best advice, and improving property standards as well. We've got some challenges coming our way. We've got the PRS database, and I think where TLIC can really work well with the NRLA is that we have got the practical, the working on the ground. In practice, we see how all of the changes that the government are throwing our way, we see how they work in practice, and we can come up with suggestions on how best to deal with that. And I think when speaking to the government, which Ben does a lot and very well, I have to say, we're also speaking to the government. We're coming from slightly different angles. However, ultimately, we all want the same end result, and that is to try and make it so that landlords can comply with the law, but that they're not changing the law so much that it just makes it impossible, that they'll just fail a bit accidentally very easily.
Okay, Teresa Wallace, Chair of the Lettings Industry Council. We wish you all the best in your new alliance with the NRLA, and thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, for those of us who have invested in and run HMOs over the years, we know that successful management can be complex and nuanced. The Renters' Rights Act has introduced a number of challenges. Now, I'm pleased to welcome my alliterative friend, Lucy Lee, Managing Director of Lee Property Services, to guide us through some of these changes. Lucy, welcome.
Hi, Ben. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. Tell us a little bit about your business.
So LEO Property Solutions has been specialising in HMOs and professional house shares across Ipswich and Suffolk since 2004. I actually started the business because as a young professional myself, I struggled to find somewhere clean, well-maintained, tidy, with people I actually wanted to live with my own age. There was a clear gap in the market, so I created what I couldn't find. Today, nearly 22 years later, we still focus primarily on working professional HMOs, typically between age 25, 35, but we also do some student house shares as well because the University of Suffolk is growing. Over that time, we've built a really strong reputation for high occupancy levels and long-term tenant stays, and that comes from being very hands-on with every part of the process. I often say that managing an HMO isn't really about managing bricks and mortar as it is more with single lets. It's more about managing relationships between multiple households under one roof. And if you get the people side right, everything else tends to follow.
Yes, well, and if you don't, it all falls to pieces somewhat sadly, doesn't it? I know from bitter experience. Now, how well do you see the changes when it comes to renters' rights and the ability to more easily have a pet affecting the management within a HMO environment? How do you see this playing out? And have you been hit with any early requests?
We haven't as yet, but first thing to say is I absolutely can see that pets do have benefits in terms of reducing loneliness and improving well-being, etc. But HMOs are just very different from single lets. In a single let property, the decision just affects the tenant that's living there, potentially the landlord at the end. But in an HMO, you're introducing that pet into a home shared by 5 or 6 unrelated people with all different lifestyles, preferences, and expectations. So it's just so different. I think the biggest concern with pets is not really the damage to the property, it's really the impact on the other people living there in our HMOs. You have to think about allergies, noise, cleanliness, use of communal spaces, and quite simply, whether everyone in that house is comfortable sharing with an animal. As a business, we've generally chosen not to allow pets in our HMOs because we have to consider the wider household, not just the individual that's making the request. If every tenant exercised their right to request a pet, some larger HMOs would very quickly become a zoo, I should think, and very difficult environments for us to manage. The way I look at it, the issue isn't really about the pets itself. The issue is about introducing a pet into a household where,
Yes.
like I say, several people unrelated are living there and making sure it's fair for everyone.
And of course, one of the checks and balances that we will need to make as HMO landlords is the impact on others before we're able to reasonably or reasonably refuse if that is the outcome.
And of course, for landlords who are interested in this topic, each request must be assessed on its own merits. And the government does give examples of when landlords can refuse requests. There's plenty more information on the NRLA website too.
Another issue that is very relevant to HMOs, I think, or could be, is the discrimination ban when it comes to tenants with children under 18. But shared properties can be exempt. And have you got any concerns about this?
I think with most HMOs, I honestly think that it's just not the environment for children. The majority of properties that we manage is designed specifically for unrelated working adults, and the way that those households operate just does not lend itself to family living and therefore a good environment for children. You've got shared kitchens, bathrooms, people working different shifts, people coming and going at all different times of day and night. And residents choose that accommodation because it suits their lifestyle. So when you introduce children into these environments, there are just additional considerations, especially around safeguarding, privacy, noise, and whether the property is generally suitable for family life. From my perspective, most professional HMOs are not typically designed to meet the needs of children. So I think landlords need to consider both the suitability of the accommodation and the impact on the existing residents before making those decisions.
I manage a number of shared house HMOs, Lucy, and I'm very interested in this idea that if one tenant gives notice now under the Renters' Rights Act, then the contract ends for the whole group of tenants. I used to do kind of tenant swaps sometimes. So, say there were 4 tenants and one moved out, then they could bring in a new person and swap them in. But of course, that's going to be different now because if one tenant gives notice, that's the end of the contract. What practical advice can you give to landlords around this? What sort of policy should they be making?
I think this is a tricky one. We actually don't deal with we only deal with individual contracts, so we don't have whole contracts, even for our student house shares, just because it works better. I would advise landlords to look at that structure. It would actually be better if each of the tenants were given individual contracts because it doesn't affect each tenant. You didn't have to do the agreement again as someone's giving notice to move out. Like you say, the challenge is if one tenant decides to leave, it just creates uncertainty for everyone else, and the remaining tenants may be perfectly happy where they are, but suddenly there's questions arising about who's staying, who's leaving. And the irony is, of course, that the aim of the renters' rights was to provide tenants with greater security and stability. But in the example that you've just suggested, it doesn't. So I think the way I'd summarise it is that legislation creates flexibility for the tenant leaving, but it's providing uncertainty. So get the landlords to think about how they're structuring those agreements.
The other issue, of course, is the kind of lack of timeline, sort of alignment on tenancies. So, for example, if the landlord wants to sell a bedsit style HMO, but not all tenants are 12 months into their contract, or 3 out of 4 tenants have given 2 months' notice to move out and one doesn't want to leave, all that's going to be trickier now, isn't it? Because in the past, we might have given all the tenants a 12-month tenancy agreement at one point, but now, that alignment's going to be very difficult.
It is. My advice to landlords would be to plan much further ahead than you may have done previously. Start conversations early, understand the position of every tenant into the house, talk to your agent to understand how realistically the process could take. But I honestly believe that communication is absolutely key here. So whether you're a landlord managing or you've got an agent, the relationship that you've created with that tenant is key, because for us, for example, we would be confident in being able to offer tenants great alternatives of rooms elsewhere. So having that relationship with them, that they'd actually be willing to move.
And do you think we'll see more tenants using HMO rooms as short lets, given that they can give 2 months' notice right from the start of the contract?
I think it very much depends. I think, yes, of course, you will start to see that. And I think on average, tenancies will naturally become shorter. However, I don't think we're suddenly going to see professional HMOs turning into Airbnb style accommodation simply because tenants can give notice from day one. The reality is that moving home is still really disruptive for people, and people don't generally enjoy packing up their belongings every couple of months, finding somewhere to live and starting again. The majority of professional tenants we deal with are looking for a home, stability, security, convenience, and they want predictable bills, good housemates, and basically a hassle-free living experience. I think the biggest factor influencing tenant mobility will be, it is the legislation. But if the tenants are happy where they live, they will tend to stay. And if they're unhappy, they'll leave. So the way I see it is that the best protection against increased tenant mobility is creating somewhere that people generally want to stay. I think the Renters' Rights Act won't necessarily separate good landlords from bad landlords as well. It will separate proactive ones from passive ones. So those maintenance issues, making sure you're on those, and operators that communicate well will create a really positive tenant experience, and the tenants will want to stay.
Lucy Lee, thanks very much for joining us. And that's it for this edition of Listen Up Landlords.
Please head to the NRLA website for more information on any of the topics we've discussed today. We'd love to hear from you.
And many thanks to Sally Walmsley, our producer, and to you for listening.